For over a century, the final days of a commercial ship were dictated entirely by the mechanics of the free market. There were no regulations, no international oversight, and absolutely no legal protections. When a vessel outlived its economic utility, owners simply sold it to the highest bidder. The ship was run aground and torn apart wherever labor was the cheapest and environmental oversight was the weakest. Active maritime trade is governed by highly organized diplomacy, negotiated in pristine Geneva boardrooms. But the end of a ship's life played out far from those rooms, operating instead in the gritty, dangerous physical reality of coastal mudflats. A ship's death was a purely physical, often brutal transaction, executed in a complete vacuum of legally binding accountability. That era officially ended on paper on June 26, 2025. On that date, the International Maritime Organization's Hong Kong Convention formally entered into force. The legal stakes are now global. A ship owner sitting in an office in Athens can be held directly, legally liable if their vessel is dismantled unsafely on a beach in South Asia. Although the treaty was drafted back in 2009, it sat dormant for 16 years, locked behind a set of interrelated mathematical requirements. Activation required ratification from 15 sovereign states, representing 40% of the world's merchant shipping tonnage, with a combined annual recycling volume equal to 3% of that exact tonnage. Regulators designed these triggers to ensure the shipping industry wouldn't instantly lose all its disposal capacity before enough compliant yards actually existed. Progress stalled for years, primarily due to a prolonged diplomatic standoff between major flag states like Panama and major recycling states like Bangladesh. The deadlock broke in June 2023, when Bangladesh and Liberia simultaneously ratified the treaty. That clicked the final tonnage threshold into place, initiating a mandatory 24-month countdown. The grace period is over. The legal architecture is finally active. But enforcing a treaty across the world's most chaotic industrial shorelines is an entirely different war. Before this convention, shipbreakers essentially bought a blind box of steel. They had absolutely no formal record of what lethal chemicals were hidden behind bulkheads or wrapped around engine pipes. The operational engine of the new law fixes this with a single, continuously updated document, the Inventory of Hazardous Materials, or the IHM. Building this document requires intense physical execution. Independent experts must board the vessel, often years before it is destined for the scrapyard, to take physical core samples of pipe lagging, deck coverings, and electrical components. This process meticulously maps the exact locations of asbestos, PCBs, ozone-depleting substances, and heavy metals contained in anti-fouling paints throughout the ship's structure. The enforcement mechanism relies heavily on global port authorities. Port state control officers can now legally detain any active trading vessel if its IHM is missing, incomplete, or improperly maintained. The IHM acts as a mandatory toxic passport. When a ship reaches the end of its life, the demolition team knows exactly where the lethal chemistry is hidden well before the first cutting torch is ever ignited. Armed with the completed IHM, the recycling yard must then draft a ship recycling plan, or SRP. This is a legally binding demolition blueprint, custom-tailored to translate the mapped hazards into a highly specific sequence of deconstruction. Yard engineers calculate the structural stresses of the hull to determine exactly where to make the primary cuts. They have to prevent the massive ship from collapsing uncontrollably, all while steering clear of the hazardous zones identified in the IHM. The ship owner cannot legally hand over the vessel until this exact plan is formally reviewed and officially approved by the competent authority, often a government ministry, of the recycling state. The rules go beyond the ship itself. The physical scrapyard must be significantly rebuilt and certified through a ship recycling facility plan. A yard can no longer consist of just a stretch of raw tidal mud and a few gas torches. Facilities are required to install heavily engineered impermeable concrete floors across all secondary cutting and hazardous waste storage zones. These heavy pads must feature integrated drainage channels to catch toxic runoff and prevent heavy metals from leaching into the coastal groundwater. Pouring massive amounts of concrete and installing heavy lifting cranes requires enormous capital investment. This severe financial cost heavily weeds out smaller, informal operators, forcing the shipbreaking sector to rapidly industrialize and consolidate into large corporate yards. All of this required infrastructure creates a severe economic friction point, known as the compliance gap. Because fully certified yards have to recoup millions in capital investments, they offer ship owners a significantly lower purchase price for their scrap vessels. To avoid this financial hit, unscrupulous ship owners actively seek out legal loopholes, attempting to sell their ships to uncertified yards that operate entirely outside the treaty's jurisdiction. The primary evasion tactic relies on flags of convenience. For a nominal fee, an owner can legally change their vessel's registry just weeks before its final voyage, adopting the flag of a sovereign state that explicitly refuses to participate in the Hong Kong Convention. Specialized cash buyers facilitate this entire shell game. They purchase the vessel, rapidly reflag it to a gray market registry, completely bypass the IHM and SRP requirements, and deliver it straight to an unregulated mudflat to maximize their profit margin. The law is technically active, but its integrity relies entirely on global port states acting as a blockade, refusing to let these uncertified, reflagged ghost ships transit through their territorial waters. When a ship follows the legal path and is successfully dismantled in a fully compliant yard, the long regulatory process concludes with one definitive piece of paperwork, the Statement of Completion. The yard issues this formal document to declare that the vessel was completely recycled in strict accordance with the approved demolition blueprint. This statement is then transmitted back to the vessel's flag state. That triggers the permanent deletion of the ship's name and IMO number from the International Maritime Registry. The Hong Kong Convention successfully established premeditated engineering for the end of a ship's life. It guarantees the safe harvesting of steel and forces accountability onto paper. But ultimately, rules on paper cannot neutralize lethal chemistry. Containing those hazards requires a grueling, deeply physical battle in the yards themselves.